shot heard around the world is probably one of the most common phrases in American lexicon when you think of American history. And that actually came from the 1836 poem by Ralph Waldo Emerson called Concord's Hymn. And it's been immortalized since then, and a lot of people kind of mix up thinking that the fighting at Lexington was the shot heard around the world. But in reality, when that was written, that is referencing the fighting that took place at Concord's North Bridge. And that's because this is the first time that American colonists were ordered to shoot at British soldiers and fire back. And of course, that's exactly what happened here in mid-morning on April 19th, 1775. Before I go down to the bridge, I just wanted to point out this home that's actually right by the bridge. This is the Old Manse, and in spring of 1775, this was actually the home of the Reverend William Emerson, grandfather to famed poet and author Ralph Waldo Emerson. And when the British soldiers came to town, most of the women and children had already fled, many to the nearby hills. The men were well aware that the soldiers were coming by the time they arrived, and they got their families essentially out of town. Not everyone, but almost everyone. And a lot of those women and children actually came here to this house because they knew the Reverend Emerson, who was the Reverend for the town of Concord, would hopefully be able to protect them. And it was from that second-story window that Emerson's family and some other folks actually watched the fighting take place at the North Bridge just behind me here. And it is believed that the Reverend Emerson was either here on his property or potentially even down there with the militia on the other side of the river. Either way, he was a witness, as well as his family, to those amazing events that took place right outside their windows here on April 19th, 1775. I'm here on the east bank of the Concord River, right by the North Bridge, and this obelisk monument you see before us was dedicated in 1836. And what's interesting of where it's at is this is actually the position that the British soldiers were at when the fighting took place. And it was erected here in 1836 because the bridge that crossed the Concord River here no longer existed at that time. In fact, a few short years after the war, the bridge was taken down, and for a long time, for decades really, there was no bridge at this point. So years later, when this monument was really the only thing dedicated to the man that fell here, and it being on the site of where the British soldiers were, a lot of local folks weren't crazy about that. So when they were gearing up for the 100-year anniversary in 1875, they gathered funds to not only build a new monument, a Minuteman statue where the actual Patriots stood on the west bank of the river, but they also got enough funds to actually rebuild a bridge as well. And what's interesting is the bridge that stands here today was made in the 1950s and is actually the fifth bridge since the one that stood here on April 19th, 1775. All right, hey everyone, this is John.
John?
He lives here in Concord, and I think you said one of your goals is to meet a ton of people and make everybody happy.
Yes.
Which I think is awesome. And John also has a pretty outstanding singing voice, and you said you can sing in multiple languages?
46.
46 languages. So
8 Asian, 5 African, 4 Middle Eastern, and 20 European.
That's awesome. And John is kind enough to give us a little bit
sample?
of a taste of that. Yeah, a sample.
Okay, here's Korean. This is the only song sung together by the North and South Korean Olympic teams at the Seoul Olympics.
Wow.
Symbolizing for me that music unites. Politics divides, music unites. Sing more, argue politics less. Here we go. Arirang, arirang, arario. Arirang 고개를 넘어간다. 나를 버리고 가시니만 짐니 넘어가서 파면한가.
I'm now on the west bank of the river, and this is actually where the Patriot militia were standing on that April morning, with the British soldiers just across there, near where that monument is at. And on April 19th in that morning, about 7:30 are when the British soldiers arrived to town. And about 400 militiamen or so were actually positioned on a hill here on the west side. Off in the distance, you can't really see it from here. But they were positioned up there, and they were standing by to see what the British soldiers would do. And they actually allowed multiple companies of British soldiers to cross this very bridge and proceed and continue to march towards the Barrett farmhouse, where they went to look for military munitions and stores that they believed to be held there. Now, as that morning progressed, British soldiers in town were actually burning a lot of the supplies that they found in the middle of the road. And those fires that the British had set created a massive column of smoke. And the hundreds of militiamen over here on this side of the river saw that smoke rising from town and really believed that the British were burning the town to the ground. Joseph Hosmer actually exclaimed, "Will you let them burn the town down?" And at that point, they decided it was time to march down towards Concord and save the town and do what they could. When they were trying to determine who would take the lead on the march, Captain Isaac Davis of the Acton militia stated that, "I have not a man that's afraid to go," which is really one of my favorite quotes. So with the Acton militia in the lead, the Patriot militia marched down from the hill and came right here to the western edge of the bridge to approach the British soldiers. Now, when they started marching down, there were actually British troops stationed here on the western side. But when they saw the approaching men, they decided that it was prudent to fall back across the river and take up positions there on the east side. As the militia approached this position, a couple of British shots rang out and hit the river right here as warning shots. That did not deter the militia, though, and as they continued to approach the bridge, the British finally unleashed a volley. And in that initial volley, two Patriot militia, both from Acton, Captain Isaac Davis and Abner Hosmer, were killed instantly. At that point, it is believed that Major Buttrick screamed out, "Fire, for God's sakes, men, fire!" The Patriot militia unleashed a volley. Two British soldiers were killed instantly, one mortally wounded, with scores other wounded, to include 4 of the 8 officers here. After the Patriots unleashed their volley, the British soldiers immediately began retreat towards the center of town in Concord. Interestingly, the American militia didn't really pursue them initially. It wasn't like there was a running fight at that point. They let the British soldiers proceed onward, and then eventually some of the militia did cross the bridge and took up positions not far from here. One other interesting story that kind of came out of that day was, you had a British soldier mortally wounded here, and that was left here on this side of the bridge. One of the stories is that a young boy that was coming across the bridge after that gunfight saw this British soldier, and whether it was out of care to just put him out of his misery or out of anger, the young man supposedly buried a hatchet in this British soldier's head, and it killed him. And that kind of spread as a rumor that the Americans were scalping the British soldiers, and from there, those rumors just continue to spread throughout the day. But here on the east side of the river is a memorial to the British soldiers that are buried here. Real quick, I want to check out this home here not far from the bridge. This is known as the Elisha Jones house. built in 1740. It's also known as the Bullet Hole House. So as the story goes, Elisha Jones, who did not participate in the fight at the bridge, was actually standing here at his house as the British soldiers fell back from the bridge. And as they saw him standing here, supposedly one of the British soldiers drew up his gun and fired a shot at him. And today, you can still see the bullet hole in the side of this house, which is pretty remarkable. You know, one thing I love about New England in this area is that there are so many of these historic homes that are still standing. And this one here is actually the home of Major John Buttrick, and he is the one who led the 400 or so militia down to the North Bridge, and we visited his grave earlier in town. This house was built about 1715 and really is just such a beautiful home, and it's awesome that it's still standing here. And right now we're on the hills just above the North Bridge. I'm not far from the Major John Buttrick house, and this is actually the field that the Minutemen and militia formed before marching down to the North Bridge. And it's so cool that this is still preserved. And if you want to get an idea of where this field is compared to the bridge, we'll go ahead and take a look. So obviously some of the topography has changed a little bit, but not that much. You look down here, there really is a commanding view of the North Bridge from where the militia mustered. You can see clearly the 1875 Minuteman statue, the bridge, and then of course the Obelisk monument over there were the British soldiers. So from up here where the militia were standing, they would have had a very clear view of the British soldiers down there positioned at the bridge. I'm about 2 miles from the North Bridge, and this is the James Barrett Farmhouse. And this was the ultimate goal of the British troops when they left Boston late on the night of April 18th. Their ultimate goal was to come up here to Concord and come to the James Barrett Farmhouse, where they believed cannon, munitions, and other supplies were being held by the Whigs. Now, one of my favorite stories of April 19th actually comes from this house. Of course, James Barrett wasn't home when the British arrived. Surely if he was, they would have either arrested him or, it wouldn't have been good. And either way, he was down serving with the militia. But when the British soldiers arrived at the house, James Barrett's wife, Rebecca, who was 57 years old at the time, she was home. And she did give them permission to search the house. I mean, at that point, they had so much time to hide a lot of these munitions. And, she gave them permission to search the house, and she warned them that, you would find nothing. And several of the tired and hungry officers ultimately asked for breakfast. They said, hey, we've been marching all night, all morning. You need to feed us. And she did end up giving them food. She gave them something to drink. And she apparently said coldly, we are commanded to feed our enemy if he hunger. And then when she refused to accept any sort of payment from these officers, they ended up throwing a few shillings at her. And then she responded, this is the price of blood. And I feel like this is just one of those many stories from the American Revolution where you had these colonists who were so bold and so outspoken. And at the same time, you can feel and hear the deep religious sentiment from Rebecca Barrett's quotes here. And it just, again, shows how devout, how faithful these people were out here in the Massachusetts countryside, but also how ready they seemed to be for independence. And I don't know. I absolutely love that story. It's definitely one of my favorites from that day. And again, just to be standing here, a little over 16 to 18 miles now at this point from Boston, and to think that when the British soldiers left late that night and started marching early in the morning of the 19th, that this was their ultimate goal right here, this farmhouse. I thought I'd finish up my time exploring Concord and the area and talking about the fight that happened at the North Bridge here in a small town called Acton. So Acton, Massachusetts was one of the towns who sent dozens and dozens of men towards the fight in Concord and further east. And if you remember, at the North Bridge, the two colonists that were killed were both from Acton, Captain Isaac Davis and Abner Hosmer. And of course, they had other folks that fought there and who died later in the day. So here in Acton, in their town square, they actually have a really neat monument that was constructed in 1851 in the graves of 3 men from Acton who died on April 19th, to include Isaac Davis and Abner Hosmer. Their graves were actually reinterred here at the base of this monument. So we're here in the town green checking that out now. Over here we have the grave of Captain Isaac Davis. If you remember, he was in charge of the Acton militia, and without missing a beat, he volunteered his men to lead the charge down towards North Bridge with the famous quote, "I've not a man who's afraid to go." And then the third burial site around here on the side is the gravesite of Abner Hosmer, who also was killed alongside Isaac Davis in the British volley at the North Bridge.